Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the iPhone 12 Pro Max and see how this phone holds up in 2023. Now, I still think this phone is completely worth it. We'll talk about some things that have changed last year, this year. I've gotten a few things already for this phone this year, which is really cool. So keep that in mind. But I will say, if you want to pick up some phones I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPhone 12 Pro Max, this was, in my opinion, actually one of the bigger changes Apple made probably in the last few years. Now, I do think the 13 Pro Max, 14 Pro Max, much better phones, but the 12 Pro Max actually gave us a bigger display at that 6.7-inch Super Retina XDR OLED panel. That was a big thing Apple did at that moment, and although maybe the rest of the phone wasn't as crazy big of an upgrade, from the iPhone 11 Pro Max, this in and of itself was a big change because this was a big display change at that moment. The first time, in a while we've gotten a display change. We did get the 6.5 inch on the XS Max, and about 2 years later we got this one. And since then, they've all been at 6.7 inches. So we do have to give this one some credit there. You still have the Face ID notch up top. You still have pretty slim bezels around it. No 120 Hz. This was actually the last Pro Max iPhone before we did get 120 Hz. So that is kind of a downside, but again, you can't have it all every single time. So it is what it is. There's not much we can do about it there. Now on the bottom of this phone, we do have the Lightning port, but on the sides of this phone, we do have the flat sides, which again, as I mentioned before, I love. I love having flat sides. I like having curved sides too, but I do think the flat sides work out a little bit better for a majority of the phones out there. So that's kind of another thing to keep in mind as well. But I think the outside of this phone still looks great. And, for sure the front and the sides, all look great for sure. Now on the back, we do have that frosted glass back, which again, I love. Having that frosted glass back of this phone has future-proofed this phone like crazy. And personally, whenever I use something like this, like with this specific phone, it just feels so premium in the hand. And I just think that's, again, one of my favorite things about this phone. The heft to this phone, it feels like a very, very heavy phone. It almost, and I said this before, it feels like a slab of gold. Like it feels like that premium of a device. So it's going to be insane to me when this phone goes down to like $200 in the used market, because it's just going to feel like it's way more than a $200 phone. And in the top left, we do have our triple camera setup with that LiDAR sensor as well. And like I mentioned before, this was actually the first time we've ever gotten that LiDAR sensor on our devices. And since then, I don't really think many apps have utilized it too well, but we still have it there, which is really cool. So we still have MagSafe capability here too, which came on this phone. We have our, IP certification on this phone too. And overall, this phone has held up very, very well in that standpoint. And I still think it is a very, very premium phone when it comes down to it. So in terms of the outside, that kind of covers it up there. Now in the camera department, as I mentioned before, we do have that triple camera setup. So we have a 12 megapixel wide angle lens, 12 megapixel telephoto lens, and then a 12 megapixel ultra wide sensor as well. Then we also have a 12 megapixel camera on the front. Now, I still think this camera is very good, and hardware-wise, we are still kind of at the same hardware that we are at now. Now, obviously, the 14 Pro Maxes have better cameras and everything, but this camera isn't too far off from that. I've done many camera comparisons between this phone and many other phones out in the marketplace, including the iPhone 14 Pro Max and many other Android phones since then. And this phone has a pretty good camera for the most part. Now, it does lack some features compared to what we have nowadays. We do not have cinematic mode on this phone. We don't have, stabilization mode, but you still have a lot of cool features like portrait mode. You still have, some other high resolution features you have as well. But a big thing is that you still have 4K 60 on the front and the back of this phone, which, as I mentioned before, is a really cool feature. Having that type of capability is awesome, and that's going to future-proof this phone even more than you can imagine. So I think that is another big thing to keep in mind. And I think in the camera department, it gets a thumbs up for me. It's still a very good camera, especially if you're going to start using apps like Snapchat or TikTok or whatever. This camera is going to be very well optimized for those types of situations. So in my opinion, it gets a thumbs up for me, and I think it's easily still one of the best features of this specific device. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now in the software and the longevity portion, this is another area that can be a little confusing. So as of right now, this phone is pretty much like, fourth in line of being discontinued. So we have the iPhone 10s, we have the iPhone 10s, the iPhone 11s, and the iPhone 12s, which this one is included. So we still have many iPhones before this that are going to be discontinued before this one. But you never know, Apple can go ahead and, drop 2 iPhones at a time nowadays, like how they did last year. So we don't know for a fact how much longer this phone's going to last. I know this phone's going to be lasting easily another 4 to 5 years. So this thing is not going anywhere anytime soon. So if you're worrying about this phone being unsupported next year, that is not going to be the case. if you have an iPhone 12 Pro Max, this phone is going to be supported for many, many years to come. So, in that standpoint, I really wouldn't worry about it too much, and I still think you're in good hands by, owning this phone, especially in the software department. And you have to keep in mind that basically all the software features that have been coming out for the last several versions of software, including iOS 16, all those features for the most part have been supported on the iPhone 12 Pro Max. So that is another cool thing going on for this device as well. So in terms of that kind of covers it up here as well. Now in the performance segment, this phone does have that Apple A14 Bionic chip inside of it, and it does have 6GB of RAM. This was, in fact, the first iPhone, or one of the first sets of iPhone, to actually bring 6GB of RAM as well. And I will definitely tell you the performance of this phone is still very, very good. This is not a slow phone. This is not a phone that you're going to pick up and feel like, oh my goodness, it's so slow. This is a very, very fast phone that can still handle everything you're going to throw at it for the most part. Now, I say that every time. For basic things like texting and calling people and whatever, it's going to be perfectly fine. For, a little bit heavier intensive applications like going through Snapchat and TikTok or whatever, those are going to be perfectly fine too, obviously. But even like with big massive games like Genshin Impact and PUBG and Call of Duty Mobile and all these other games that, are available now, again, this phone can run everything you throw at it. And that A14 chip is technically only kind of like one generation behind if you think about it. The iPhone 14 still had this, chipset, although the iPhone 14 Pro does have, the A16. I think this phone is still a very good performing phone as well. And from everything that I've tested with it, from heavy intensive games to basic games and basic applications, I've had a great time, and I don't really think, again, it's really that much to complain about. So from that perspective, very good performing phone. And again, I still think it's probably one of its best features. Now, in the battery life department, this was one of the weirder aspects of this phone. So it had a 3,687 milliamp-hour battery, and things like this, I don't know why Apple does this. They gave us a bigger phone, but they gave us a smaller battery. So I don't know how they gave us a bigger phone from the 11 Pro Max, but since then the battery life on our phone have gotten better and better on the 13 Pro Max and 14 Pro Max. Unfortunately, with the 12 Pro Max, this has been notoriously, I think, one of the weirder aspects of this phone. It's still it's still a good battery life, but just keep in mind that you may notice that it may not be as good as something like a 13 Pro Max or a 14 Pro Max, so that might be one reason why you may want to stick with one of those types of phones over this one. So, although in my opinion, I still think this phone is completely worth it, there's nothing really too, massive to, say against it, that battery life thing is one of the weirder areas of this device. So, to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I'll tell you is, I think the iPhone 12 Pro Max is still completely worth it. I still think it's a great phone. It has a ton of capability, tons of features for sure. And I've been saying for a long time now that this is a very good phone, and it is a good phone. But I think since then, now that we have phones like the iPhone 13 Pro Max and the 14 Pro Max, you may just want to go for those phones, especially with the 13 Pro Max being over a year old now. You can probably buy that phone for much cheaper than what it used to be. So I'd probably recommend going down that road, but it is what it is. That's kind of how the 12 Pro Max holds up in 2023. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.